Hi everybody, this is Gabby and Elysabeth on our podcast about Canadian history. Today is part 2 of our series about residential schools in Canada, and today we're talking about the current issues and the intergenerational trauma that has been caused by residential schools.
In May 2021, the remains of 215 Indigenous children killed in a residential school in British Columbia were found. Because of this, they appointed an independent school interlocutor for missing children and unmarked graves and burial sites associated with Indian residential schools. Her name was Kimberly Murray. She was appointed on June 8th in 2022. Her job is to work closely and collaboratively with Indigenous leaders, communities, survivors, family, and she is expected to identify needed measures and recommend a new federal legal framework to ensure respectful and culturally appropriate treatment and protection for the unmarked graves.
Since the grave discovery in May 2021, thousands of unmarked graves have been found at former residential school sites across Canada, but those thousands more are still unaccounted for. Call to Actions 74 to 76 are in progress and apply to finding the burial grounds. Action 74, inform the families of children who died at residential schools of the child's burial location. Action 75, develop and implement procedures for the identification and maintenance of residential school cemeteries. And finally, Action 76, Aboriginal communities should lead development of residential school cemetery identification and maintenance strategies.
There is a residential school settlement agreement that began on September 19, 2007. The settlement agreement represents the consensus reached between legal counsel for former students, legal counsel for the churches, the Assembly of First Nations, other Indigenous organizations, and the Government of Canada. It includes 5 different elements to address the legacy of Indian residential schools. These are a common experience payment for all eligible former students of Indian residential schools, an independent assessment process for claims of sexual or serious physical abuse, measures to support healing such as the Indian Residential School Resolution Health Support Program, and an endowment to the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. Commemorative activities and the establishment of Truth and Reconciliation Commission are also on there.
Now, please excuse us for the interruption. We have a short ad break from our sponsor,
First Response Glass.
Get outside. All you do is play video games.
Fine. Hey, where's Tommy going?
I sent him outside. He needs to learn to get some fresh air and be one with nature.
You know what? It looks like he's gonna shoot a hockey puck right at the...
Hi, Mom.
Get inside!
When you need your glass replaced, call First Response Glass. Hassle-free. First Response Glass fixes it.
Some of the challenges residential school survivors still face include a loss of language, culture, to traditional stories and lessons, mental well-being, and then also drugs and alcohol are often used as a coping mechanism by survivors and their families. So we're going to do a group discussion with our Biology 12 class on the article called How Parents' Trauma Leaves Biological Traces in Children. Adverse experiences can change future generations through epigenetic pathways, and this is by Rachel Yuda, I think. So to start us off, Dr. G, what is epigenetics?
Okay, well, first of all, epigenetics is a field of molecular genetics that specifically looks at what are factors that can turn genes on or off. And those factors can be environmental stimuli. It can also be something like a chemical that you might ingest. So it's trying to understand how, and a good analogy is that if everybody here has the same recipe for baking a cake, and we all bake that cake, why is it that that cake can turn out differently for each person? And it often has to do with, if you think about DNA, it has to do with the oven and the settings of the oven, and how your oven works determines how your cake bakes. So that's an analogy.
Okay, and then how does the trauma get passed on through epigenetics? What's an example of that?
Okay, well, I might turn this over to you. So I might be asking you guys a little bit about what you think about the article itself. So when he first started off, or she started off, Rachel, giving a summary, if you will, about maybe why this topic is important. They go back to a hallmark event, perhaps before your time. So September 11th, the Twin Tower, if you will, bombings. And they looked at a previous study where the doctor was going to be doing physical examinations on pregnant women to see if they were suffering at all from experiences of post-traumatic stress disorder. And more importantly, the question arose is whether or not the fetuses were at risk, right? And so when they started looking at the evidence, the blood analysis, not just the qualitative description by the mothers about how they felt, they were able to notice something interesting. Do you remember, or did you pick up on the article what that was?
Yeah, that the stress-related hormone cortisol was lower, oftentimes when the mother was the one with the trauma. And isn't cortisol a hormone that is supposedly supposed to be higher in stress?
It is, but only in acute stress. So at the end of the day, this big article, what it ends up showing through different examples in the Twin Tower World Trade bombings, where it was an acute, sudden, singular event, cortisol will be elevated, right, initially. However, when they look at people who are suffering from stress or trauma over long periods, for example, people who endured the Holocaust, or if you want to connect it to Indigenous persons who would have lived through years at a residential school, or perhaps whose parents were at residential schools, they're going to be exposed to stress for long periods. And that exposure over a long period as well as an acute period, by the end of the article, they show have different results. One has low levels of cortisol and the other one had higher levels of cortisol. So the higher level of cortisol is actually for the acute and the lower level is for the long-term exposure. But at the end of the day, what was really interesting that they noticed about the babies. You remember? The fetuses and then eventually the babies. Yeah, so the babies of the mothers who had their blood taken and expressed similar, if not the same levels of cortisol as their mothers did. And they also noticed that women that were in the third trimester, so that final, if you will, 1/3 of pregnancy, those babies had greater effects than women who were deemed pregnant in a first or second trimester when that event happened. So the more developed the child was closer to birth, then the stronger, if you will, the connection was to what the mother's event was itself. All right, so at the beginning, what they're trying to show is that if there was a problem that they're looking to investigate, the question would be, were mothers at risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder from being exposed, if you will, to the World Trade Center collapse? That precipitated a second question about whether or not fetuses were at risk, and they were going to use the evidence from the mother and then the unexpected evidence from the babies to try and come up with an explanation. But what they ended up, if you will, making a connection to was one of the researchers was doing a study already about Holocaust survivors. And so what they noticed initially, they connected to a second study, and that opened up a broader investigation and a desire for a scientific model to explain why people in exposure to stress have, if you will, ongoing elevated or lower than normal levels of hormone.
The article mentions that the babies were also born smaller than usual. What do you think? Why do you think that affects their size?
Well, often when babies are affected, it's affected by access to nutrition. And if you have somebody who either mothers would have access to food, so the question is, why would they not be processing that food? And that has everything to do with enzymes. And enzymes, remember, are the production of GNA translation. So therefore, if you have something related to enzymes not working as well, or an enzyme that controls hormone distribution, and hormones, if you will, control metabolism, then that means then that the baby is not going to be able to exercise its full metabolic rights because the mother's physiological symptoms are being dampened down or controlled by whatever chemical markers are being dictated from the DNA and the DNA that's being damaged.
Could it have an effect on somebody's kids if they didn't experience the stress while they were pregnant, or do they
So remember, if you looked at the study, and I don't know if anybody wants to jump in here, what were they showing as an example that you did not have to be exposed to that direct stimulus of stress, but you are more vulnerable to developing PTSD or having behavior, mood alterations, or even psychosis? Do you remember when they were talking about that in the article?
It was the children of Holocaust survivors that had elevated chances of developing PTSD and stuff like that. So they didn't experience the Holocaust themselves, but they grew up in an environment with parents who have.
Do you remember the person in the article that they profiled? His name was Joseph. Do you remember reading about Joseph? Tell me about Joseph.
Both of Joseph's parents were spent many years living in a Holocaust camp, but Joseph himself never experienced the trauma. But since he was born with all symptoms of PTSD, including nightmares, as if he had suffered the trauma himself.
So one of the things they showed is that from acute and sustained trauma, babies will be born and show symptoms of like fear, separation, anxiety from their mother, and they will have elevated and sometimes depressed, depending on, if you will, the type of trauma the parent exhibited. If it's low level, that means that something has happened in the DNA and it's an adaptation to their parent's stress that they have taken on, if you will, a genetic adaptation that's supposed to make them more resilient. But it actually shows that they actually have a greater chance of developing PTSD, even if they weren't exposed to a traumatic experience. But like you said, Keelan, right, because of having both parents that were survivors of the Holocaust and always being raised in an environment of hearing stories, hearing about that trauma, and then being, if you will, encouraged to go off and do something. Do you remember what his mother kept wanting him to do? And he hadn't done it yet. So there was all this pressure to do this because it's like he owed them. Yes, the mother said, remember, I didn't survive Auschwitz so that my own child would end the family line. You have an obligation to me and to history to have children. So it says here on page, let's see, I think it's 4 of 16. It says, in turn, this is a researcher, we ended up talking to many people like Joseph, adult children of Holocaust survivors who suffered from anxiety, grief, guilt, dysfunctional relationships, and intrusions of Holocaust-related imagery. So therefore, talking to Joseph and having, it goes back to the nature versus nurture environment, he not only had, from a nature point of view, changes in his DNA, but he also had the environment, the nurturing environment that would bring on classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, even though he never lived through the Holocaust himself. And they noticed this in children of Vietnam War vets. That's where PTSD, that word, comes from. And it also showed that Vietnam War vets who were also abused as children, they had probably the lowest cortisol levels that they noticed in the sampling itself. And that meant that they had a higher chance of having adrenaline take over instead of cortisol to heighten any experience that could be seen as a flight or fight, if you will, experience. So they had a stronger reaction to things. Right? Where else would you like to take the conversation, ladies?
I don't have any more points. We're pretty good on time, too.
Yeah.
Any final remarks?
I would like to make one. I think this was important. So if you skip, and this was a little bit of a long article, very good indeed. So even though they did blood samples in humans and were able to engage in in-depth conversations, where do you think the scientific evidence really packs a punch that epigenetics in this case is real?
Yeah.
The mice experiments, right? Where they would, for example, they would give a male mouse an electric shock when it would smell cherry blossom scent, and therefore connecting fear response to odor. The response was accompanied down the, if you will, through successive exposures with epigenetic changes to brain and sperm, and therefore 2 generations beyond the grandfather mice who were subjected to the shock with the cherry blossom scent, the grandchildren had that same association and had the same behavior to cherry blossom smell, even though they were not shocked themselves as mice. So that really is the scientific, if you will, evidence using animal, if you will, data. And I think the last point we should end on, and it comes in the last 2 pages, right? So the survival, there is a survival advantage, if you will, from intergenerational transmission, and it depends on the type of environment that the offspring finds them in. If they're in a positive environment, then they will have accrued something in their DNA that gives them the ability to adapt if something happens. However, if they are kept in a stressful situation, then that damage will predispose them to actually be worse off. So at the end of the day, taking all of this information, it gives a lot of understanding to what could be therapy programs. And in terms of the mice itself, the mice were shown that they could be reconditioned to lose their fear of cherry blossoms, if you will, and get over it and not have that fear response. So in other words, people who have had exposure to intergenerational trauma and epigenetic effects on their DNA, they can actually be trained through therapy of sorts to lose that response and to re-regulate, if you will, their genetics and enzymes and hormonal control of behavior. So in other words, just because you're damaged from your parents doesn't mean you can't go on to live a healthy, happy, fruitful life and not pass that on to your children, perhaps. And it's all because of methylation. But that will be a topic for another podcast.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for joining us for our educational podcast about Canadian history and residential schools. This concludes our episode 2 as well as our series on this topic. Thank you for listening. Bye.